1 second ago. Jay-Z confronts Diddy in COUT. Diddy isn't ready for this New York. The courtroom had already spent the morning drowning in routine. Prosecutors flipped through binders, defense attorneys whispered behind cupped palms, and the gallery of journalists had begun exchanging gossip louder than their keystrokes. Then the doors opened and the air changed. Sean Carter walked in, unannounced, unescorted, and unmistakably serious. The room froze. No warning, no entourage, no Beyoncé, no Rock Nation shield of advisors. Just Jay-Z alone in a sharply cut navy suit that absorbed the overhead lighting like slate. One journalist's pen rolled off her pad. Cassie Ventura leaned toward her attorney, whispering. Even the judge briefly raised her brow. Diddy, seated at the defense table, stopped scribbling and looked up. His eyes didn't blink. The courtroom had not expected to see Jay-Z, not on the witness list, not under oath, not like this. He took the stand, swore the oath, and the space packed with federal prosecutors, celebrity correspondents, and attorneys used to closing multi-million-dollar deals over brunch leaned in like they were listening to the drop of an unreleased track. "I want to make it clear," he said, his voice calm but tense. "I came here because silence ain't an option no more." The sentence didn't land like a performance. It hit like a verdict. He didn't start with denial. He started with context. Yes, he had attended Diddy's events. Yes, he had been invited to private spaces. But what he saw and what others claimed to have happened were not the same thing. "Let me be clear," he said. "I never went into those rooms. I never signed those NDAs. But I knew something wasn't right." That sentence cracked the courtroom open. It wasn't an admittance of guilt. It was something more dangerous, an admission of knowing, of being near the machinery without pulling the levers, of seeing enough to understand what it meant to turn away. When asked about a 2015 party in Miami, allegedly for Christian Combs' birthday, Jay-Z didn't dodge. "They had masks," he said, his voice flat. "Not the kind you wear for fun. The kind that make people look like they're hiding something." He described one man walking past in full leather and high heels, his eyes screaming something no one else in the room would acknowledge. "People laughed," he said. "I didn't." Because he looked scared. He told the court he left early that night. Called a separate car, didn't wait for the scheduled service. He didn't want his name associated with whatever was unfolding behind closed doors. It sounded like distance, but it wasn't distance enough. Then the prosecution produced the photograph, a leaked blurry image, Jay-Z, Diddy, LeBron James, Beyoncé, a man in a latex mask on his knees. The courtroom tensed again. Jay-Z stared at the image in silence before answering. "I was told it was performance art," he said. "I didn't laugh. I didn't stay." He turned and faced Diddy for the first time. "You knew people trusted you," he said. "You used that." And with that, the nature of his presence changed. This was no longer a damage control appearance. It was something closer to public reckoning. He recounted a private conversation from late 2018, a moment that now echoed louder than any stage verse he'd ever performed. He told me, "They're coming for me. You gotta be careful who you stand next to." Jay-Z paused. I asked him, "Did you do something I can't come back from?" According to Jay-Z. Diddy's answer was chilling. "It's just parties, Jay. Just experiences. Nobody gets hurt unless they want to." The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. Jay-Z said he stopped answering Diddy's calls after that. He began stepping away, canceling collaborations, withdrawing from events, instructing Rock Nation staff to keep their name away from Combs' ventures. He saw the iceberg before it hit the hull. Then came the documentation. The folder. The timeline. Flight records placing him in Paris the night of the alleged Miami freak-off. Hotel invoices. Photographs. Eyewitness accounts. Security detail logs. A video from the Plaza Athénée. The prosecution verified each item. The judge nodded as the clerk confirmed every timestamp. He wasn't there. But the damage was done long before that night. And Jay-Z wasn't finished. He shifted to a broader point. A cultural indictment, not of one man, but of the ecosystem that allowed rumor to calcify into character assassination. My daughter asked me what a freak-off was, he told the court. That's not something a father should have to explain. He talked about the swarm outside his home, the paparazzi circling Blue Ivy's school, the headlines folding lies into truths, without ever calling for comment. When did accusation become conviction, he asked. When did we stop demanding proof? His voice hardened. Not defensive, defiant. I've spent decades building something clean, he said. Something that lifts our community. And with one headline they painted in filth. He reminded the jury without raising his voice that the culture of clickbait doesn't seek truth, it rewards virality. That the public rarely pauses to ask if the story has a spine, only if it has a shock. Then came the final reversal. The prosecution introduced a new claim that Jay-Z had been present at a separate Miami party, hosted by Gloria and Emilio Estefan, one that featured prominently in Cassie Ventura's testimony. Jay-Z didn't flinch. I have never in my entire life attended a party at Gloria Estefan's house. Not in Miami, not anywhere. He handed over another stack of documents. A charity dinner hosted by the Sean Carter Foundation, a guest list, a speech transcript, a photograph with the mayor of Los Angeles. Security logs time-stamped his arrival and exit at the Peterson Automotive Museum down to the minute. Again the prosecution verified the material. Again the judge nodded. Then Jay-Z addressed the heart of the matter. This isn't about guilt by association, he said. It's about guilt by proximity. I once attended brunch, so now I'm complicit in everything this man's accused of. He leaned toward the jury. If you're going to drag a man into a trial this big, you better have more than gossip and guesses. He called out the lawsuits, the vague language, the innuendos presented as evidence, the suggestion that because he had once been in a room, he must have seen what others did behind the curtain. Not one outlet asked for a comment, he said. Not one. He pulled out a Reddit thread. Thousands of upvotes, conspiracy webs linking him to Jeffrey Epstein, R. Kelly, even accusations surrounding Aaliyah and Michael Jackson. He read them, aloud. They say, where there's smoke, there's fire. But sometimes he paused. It's just fog machines and YouTube edits. The courtroom didn't laugh. It listened. He didn't say he was perfect. He said he was present and that he left. I didn't speak up sooner because I thought the truth would be obvious, he said. But I underestimated how fast lies move when they come wrapped in production value. He ended his statement not with a plea, but a challenge. I'm not asking you to like me. I'm asking you to listen, to think, to demand proof. Because if we don't draw the line here, then none of us are safe from what comes next. And then he sat back, not as an artist, not as a billionaire, but as a man who understood exactly how high the cost of silence had become. The room hadn't truly settled, not after that. Not after a man like Jay-Z stepped off the witness stand, leaving a courtroom full of prosecutors, reporters, and jurors, balancing two realities, what they thought they knew, and what had just been laid bare. But federal court doesn't pause for reflection. Silence isn't a destination. It's a hallway, and someone always steps through. This time it was the lead prosecutor. Known for his precision, not theatrics, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His questions had toppled musicians, executives, and tech CEOs. He had a reputation for grinding truth out of charisma like stone from silk. He adjusted his stance before the jury flipped to the appropriate tab in his binder and looked up. Mr. Carter, he said, tone neutral, but deliberate. Let's talk about your proximity. Jay-Z's posture didn't shift. His hands remained folded. His eyes stayed locked on the man who now held the floor. You've stated you never attended a private party at the Estefan residence. That's correct. You've submitted documentation proving you were in Los Angeles at the Peterson Museum during that time. Jay-Z nodded. Down to the minute. Impressive record-keeping, the prosecutor replied. But let me ask you this. How many events hosted by Mr. Combs have you attended over the years? There it was. Jay-Z's face remained unreadable. Too many to count, he said. Fundraisers, award after-parties, industry mixers, brunches, the usual. The prosecutor let that hang. Public events, he echoed. Industry events. Jay-Z didn't blink. Nothing like what's being described here. The prosecutor leaned in just slightly, not with aggression, but with calculation. And at any of those events, did you ever witness anything inappropriate? Anything that made you pause? A noticeable stillness crept back into the courtroom. Jay-Z's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. He chose his words carefully. Not for long, he said finally, but enough for everyone to notice. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Could you elaborate? I saw celebrities networking, music playing, standard fare, Jay-Z said, but also quiet moments, odd disappearances, people getting escorted out of rooms, not by staff, but by silence. Silence. It's louder than you think, counselor. There was no objection. Just the kind of pause that makes jurors grip their pens tighter. And Cassie Ventura, the prosecutor asked, did you ever see her at any of these events? She was often present. She was with Puff. Jay-Z answered, his tone clipped. And did she ever appear in distress? Vulnerable, uncomfortable. Jay-Z drew in a breath through his nose. Not in ways I understood at the time, he said. Looking back, maybe. Maybe I didn't see her cry. I didn't see her scream. I didn't see what she's described, but I saw how she avoided certain hallways. The courtroom held its breath, and if you had seen something criminal, the prosecutor pressed. Jay-Z looked directly at the jury. I wouldn't be here testifying, he said. I'd be sitting where he is. He didn't have to gesture toward Diddy. Everyone knew where the weight was falling. The prosecutor held up a transcript from a sealed deposition. Then another photo, then a text exchange, allegedly between Roc Nation staff and an anonymous source warning that NDAs might be weaponized. Jay-Z confirmed it. I knew what that meant, he said. Silence used as a shield. And your silence, Mr. Carter, was it? Protection. Jay-Z stared at the prosecutor. No smile, no pause. It was distance, he said. Until distance didn't work anymore, the gallery whispered. A journalist typed with 2 fingers hunched so tight, her keyboard shook. You expect this jury to believe you saw the system forming, but stayed silent because you never walked into a particular room. I didn't walk into those rooms, Jay-Z said, again slower. But I saw the locks. I saw who had the keys. And did you ever ask why there were locks at all? Jay-Z responded with something close to fury, but delivered with surgical restraint. This industry's built on velvet ropes, he said. But some of them don't lead to VIP lounges. Some of them lead to things nobody wants to talk about, until it's too late. The prosecutor pressed again. Did you benefit from Mr. Combs' events, his influence? Jay-Z nodded once. I benefited from his orbit. That's how this game works. You rise by who you know, until knowing them starts to feel like weight, not wind. And when did it turn to weight? Jay-Z hesitated. When I realized silence wasn't neutral, he said. It was endorsement, and I won't be complicit in that. Not now. Not in front of my daughter, not in front of history. Diddy finally looked up, his jaw tight, pen no longer moving. The prosecutor looked back at his notes, slowly closing the folder. No further questions at this time. Jay-Z didn't exhale. He didn't slouch. He stepped down from the witness stand with the same calm he had walked in with, except this time the silence that followed him wasn't fear. It was recalibration. One juror scribbled furiously. Another rubbed his temple. A court officer leaned against the back wall and crossed her arms. Outside, social media was already erupting, but inside the courtroom had entered a quieter phase of reckoning. This wasn't just the trial of Sean Combs anymore. It was the trial of what the industry had ignored, what the media had amplified, and what silence had cost those close enough to smell the smoke, but too scared to call it fire. and Jay-Z had lit a match, not to burn it down, but to make sure nobody could say they didn't see it. The courtroom had seen testimony. It had seen strategy. But it hadn't yet seen Jay-Z break, not under oath, not under pressure, and not even now as the prosecution circled back, with renewed intent not just to undermine his words, but to question his character. There was a shift in temperature, not dramatic, but palpable, not in degrees, but in direction. Jay-Z, until now calm and calculating, had started to show something else: fatigue wrapped in focus, the posture of someone who knew exactly what he was risking, and had already made peace with the cost. The prosecutor stood again. "Mr. Carter," he began, less formal this time. "You've said you began distancing yourself from Mr. Combs after 2018. Jay-Z nodded. "After he called you and warned in your words that they were coming for him. Yes. But you didn't go public. No. You didn't alert anyone." Jay-Z's voice was even. "I told my team. I canceled deals. I instructed Rock Nation staff to create distance. I didn't go to the press because at the time there was nothing solid, just noise." The prosecutor tilted his head. "And if that noise was actually a signal?" "Then I missed it," Jay-Z replied. "But I didn't amplify it either." The prosecutor stepped toward the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not claiming Mr. Carter participated in any crime. But we must consider the culture that allowed these alleged crimes to exist, a culture of silence, of selective ignorance." Jay-Z didn't interrupt. He waited. So the prosecutor continued. "If you saw locks, NDAs, confiscated phones, if you saw masked figures at parties you chose to attend, why not walk away the first time? Why not speak up then?" Jay-Z leaned forward. "Because when you're standing in the middle of the machine, it doesn't look like a machine. It looks like success, networking, music, culture, and by the time you see the smoke, you're already breathing it." There was no objection, just silence. He continued. "I didn't walk away after one strange night. I walked away after a pattern, when it became undeniable, when Puff stopped being a friend and started sounding like a warning label." Diddy, unmoving for most of the morning, scribbled something onto his legal pad and underlined it hard. The prosecutor turned the page. "Let's talk about your family," he said. The gallery stirred. Everyone knew where this was going. "You've testified that this scandal affected them directly, that your daughter, Blue Ivy, read headlines about freak-off parties and asked you questions no child should. Yes. Do you believe your silence contributed to that moment?" Jay-Z paused. "My silence was meant to protect them," he said. "But yeah, maybe it did the opposite." And Beyoncé, the prosecutor, pressed. "How has she responded to your name being dragged into this?" Jay-Z's face shifted for the first time, less guarded, more human. "She's stood by me," he said. "But this was different. This wasn't business beef or career rumors. This was nuclear. It was a lie that treated us like props in someone else's fire." "Props," Jay-Z nodded. "People used our names to sell the story. We were never in Miami that night. We were in Paris at the Plaza Athénée. We had receipts, photos, witnesses, and yet the media ran with it anyway. Yes. Because the truth was slower. Yes." The prosecutor retrieved the photo again, the now infamous image of Jay-Z, Diddy, LeBron James, Beyoncé, and the masked man. He asked if Jay-Z remembered that moment. "I do," Jay-Z said. "I was told it was performance art. I didn't laugh. I didn't stay. And yet your name is now part of that legacy." Jay-Z didn't flinch. "My legacy is bigger than one room and one photo." He looked at the jury. "I've spent 30 years building something clean, something that moves culture forward, that invests in black ownership, education, criminal justice reform. I took hip-hop from the streets to the boardroom. And now, because I once stood in the wrong room, people want to rewrite that." He leaned back, not to rest, but to brace. "I'm not here to erase what happened to others. I'm here because my name was used to silence them, to make it look like everything was okay. If I say nothing, I validate that lie." The prosecutor didn't interrupt. Neither did the judge. And when your name becomes a shield for someone else's actions, Jay-Z said you have two options: disappear or speak. There was no applause. This wasn't a concert. But the tension in the room was no longer adversarial. It was reflective. The jury wasn't leaning in out of curiosity anymore. They were leaning in because the narrative had turned. Jay-Z was no longer on defense. He was redefining the story. The prosecutor gave a slight nod and returned to the table. The judge called for a short recess. Reporters surged out into the hallway. Social media exploded again. Within minutes, shock Jay-Z testimony, protect the legacy, and end a machine were trending. The New York Times released an alert. TMZ uploaded a play-by-play. Even fashion blogs paused to analyze the tailoring of Jay-Z's suit. Back inside the courtroom emptied briefly. But the jurors stayed in place longer than necessary. Juror 4, a woman in her 50s with a beige pantsuit and blue-lensed glasses, tapped her pen against her notebook, not writing, just thinking. Juror 9 stared at the now empty witness stand like he expected it to speak again. Diddy remained seated, his fingers pressed together. Lips thin, eyes scanning the empty gallery like it owed him an explanation. When Jay-Z returned to his seat near counsel, he didn't look at the gallery or at Diddy. He looked at the jury. Not with pity, not with defiance, with the kind of stare that said, "You've heard the noise. Now, hear the record." And somewhere in the stillness of that gaze, the trial shifted again from one about allegations and evidence to one about legacy, silence, and who gets to define truth when history is still being written. The trial was never going to be about just one man. That fiction collapsed the moment Jay-Z took the stand. Now every look, every absence, every sudden shift in support was under the microscope. And what had begun as a case about Diddy's alleged abuse was expanding into something far more fragile: the disintegration of an entire era's power structure. Jay-Z wasn't simply defending himself. He was knowingly or not testifying against a system he'd once been part of. And when the courtroom resumed that afternoon, the mood had changed. The air had thinned. Not from tension, but from clarity. The defense requested no cross-examination. There was nothing to gain. Instead, the silence gave room for the ripple effect. In the gallery, a former intern from Bad Boy Records was seen wiping tears from her eyes. When asked later by a reporter what had moved her, she simply said, "He talked like he didn't know. Maybe he didn't. But we saw him at those events. Maybe he just looked away." Even Cassie Ventura, composed and stone-faced during most of the proceedings, had lifted her head when Jay-Z mentioned his daughter by name. It wasn't empathy. It was something else, an unspoken question. Was he protecting his family or protecting himself? The lines were blurring, and outside the courtroom, they weren't waiting for a verdict. Headlines flooded digital timelines. Jay-Z breaks, silence, names the machine, Jay-Z defends Beyoncé and Blue Ivy, from scandal fallout courtroom shaken by unexpected testimony. But inside, the real shift was in how the jury absorbed the silence. No longer passive, they had become quiet observers of a deeper reckoning, one that stretched far beyond the scope of federal law. This was a trial of proximity, reputation, and the price of standing too close for too long. And then came the leaks. An internal memo circulated within Revolt Media surfaced online. It showed that Roc Nation had begun cutting sponsorship ties in early 2019. Another document confirmed that Jay-Z's legal team had reached out privately to multiple media outlets in 2020, warning them against running false connections between him and Diddy's private dealings. He hadn't gone public, but he had moved. The courtroom didn't acknowledge these developments directly. The prosecution simply entered them into the record without fanfare. But the subtext was clear. Jay-Z hadn't waited for the headlines. He had anticipated them, silently. Diddy's defense attorneys shifted in their chairs, their confidence fraying. What had started as a fortress of plausible deniability was now riddled with holes, each one created by someone who had once stood beside their client and was now walking away in full view of the public. But the most damaging blow came not from a file, a photo, or a folder, but from a single sentence. In the final portion of his testimony, Jay-Z addressed the claim that he and Beyoncé had attended a private freak-off event at a Miami mansion owned by the Estefans. The prosecution had already failed to tie him to the location. But Jay-Z didn't stop at the exoneration. "I want to be very clear," he said. "Not only have I never attended a party at Gloria Estefan's house, I've never even been invited. These rumors don't come from memory, they come from convenience." He unfolded a second timeline. Charity events, mayor's attendance, public speeches, security footage. A photograph of Jay-Z shaking hands with an elected official during the exact time the alleged party was supposed to have occurred. Again, the facts matched. Again, the narrative failed. But it wasn't the evidence that landed hardest. It was what followed. He looked directly at the prosecution and said, "If you're going to drag a man into a trial this big, you better have more than gossip and guesses." The court reporter didn't flinch. The jury didn't move. But a few journalists exchanged glances. They knew that line would lead every article by sundown. Then for the first time, Jay-Z spoke not to clear himself, but to indict the culture that had allowed his name to be twisted into a weapon. "They say where there's smoke, there's fire," he said. "But sometimes the smoke is just fog machines and YouTube edits." He held up a printed Reddit thread with over 18,000 upvotes, linking him to Jeffrey Epstein, Michael Jackson's death, even conspiracy theories about Aaliyah. There were no sources, no witnesses, just speculation draped in theatrics. "This is what passes for journalism now," he asked. "This is how we treat the truth. Because someone made a TikTok with ominous music and grainy photos." He didn't look angry. He looked tired. "I stayed quiet because I thought the truth was obvious," he said. "But I underestimated how fast a lie can travel when it comes in high definition." The room didn't respond, because nothing needed to be said. And still the wave hadn't crested. Later that evening, while the court was in recess, 50 Cent posted a photo of Jay-Z on the witness stand with the caption, "Nice performance. But we ain't forgot them brunches, my guy." It went viral. Within hours, Alicia Keys reposted a quote about silence and integrity. Questlove tweeted 3 cryptic emojis. Oprah posted an Instagram story about rebuilding from ashes. The cultural divide was complete. Some saw Jay-Z as a man coming clean. Others saw him as a man walking away from a house he helped furnish. And in the middle stood Beyoncé, silent, absent, yet present in every frame, every headline, every breath of scrutiny. Her name had trended globally for over 36 hours. Her publicist declined comment. Fans defended her. Others asked how deep the connection went. Jay-Z, for his part, never used her as a shield. When he spoke of her, it was as a mother, a woman caught in the shrapnel of a narrative she never signed on to. And for the first time in his life, Jay-Z wasn't trying to control the room. He was trying to survive it. The court would reconvene the next morning. But the verdict in many ways was already being written, not by the judge, not by the jury, but by the public watching every blink, every sentence, every absence. This wasn't just a trial of fact. It had become a trial of legacy, and the only question left was who would still be standing when the smoke cleared. By the 5th day of testimony, the trial no longer belonged to Diddy. His name may have been on the docket, but the courtroom had shifted its gravity. All eyes were on the legacy players, those who had shaped an industry now standing at a moral crossroads. Jay-Z had redefined the stakes. Not through dramatics, but through clarity, through timelines, receipts, and a single unspoken message. If the system collapses, it will not take him down with it. But courtrooms are not ruled by culture, they're ruled by law. And so the prosecution returned with one last attempt. This time they reframed. Mr. Carter, the assistant U.S. attorney, began, "You've said silence was no longer an option, but for years it was. Jay-Z didn't blink. You've called yourself an observer, someone who didn't participate but who saw the structures forming. So for the record, what exactly did you see? Jay-Z didn't look away from the jury. I saw phones being taken. I saw NDAs handed out. I saw who got in and who didn't. I saw what power looked like when it stopped pretending to be fun. And you said nothing. I told my people. I stepped back. I canceled deals. I removed myself. I acted quietly, but I acted. The prosecutor asked, "But if you had spoken publicly back then, do you think some of this could have been prevented?" Jay-Z answered with a truth that made the room exhale as one. If I'd spoken too soon, no one would have believed me. Not because it wasn't true, but because of who he was, and who I am. That was the paradox no one wanted to say out loud. Jay-Z wasn't just a celebrity. He was proof that proximity to power was both armor and liability. And to break silence in an industry that thrives on allegiance meant risking everything. He continued, "I've spent decades telling young black men to build their name, protect it. But I learned that sometimes your name is the first thing they weaponize." He paused. His voice lowered. "They used mine to legitimize rooms I never walked into." And then, unprompted, he looked to the gallery. "My name doesn't belong in their narrative. My family doesn't. My legacy doesn't. This trial, this moment is the line. If we don't draw it now, they'll keep pulling us in until no one can tell who stood where." There were no further questions. The judge called for recess. Outside the courthouse, the mood was different. No longer reactive. It had turned reflective. A man once elevated for his mystique had chosen to speak plainly, and in doing so had exposed not just what he saw, but what he almost became. That night, something else shifted. A number of smaller publications issued retractions. At least 3 outlets publicly apologized for running speculation without verification. Jay-Z's legal team issued no press release, no victory lap. Just one brief statement. Mr. Carter testified under oath without preconditions. His record stands. But that wasn't the end. Because the court had yet to hear from those who once stood beside him. The final day of testimony wasn't loud. There were no surprise witnesses, no viral moments. But in its quiet, something more powerful emerged. The alternate juror who had spent most of the trial chewing a pen cap and scribbling sat up straighter than usual. Juror 4, who had watched Jay-Z like a school principal tracking every word, seemed more still than skeptical now. The court clerk announced the schedule for closing arguments. The judge reminded everyone that public opinion was not evidence. But it no longer mattered, because something irreversible had happened. Jay-Z had pulled his name out of the machinery, and the machinery sputtered. In the days that followed, the industry responded, some with subtle distance, others with overt detachment. Revolt quietly removed Diddy's branding from its homepage. Rock Nation held firm on silence. Spotify editorial teams removed several collaborative playlists linking the two moguls. Corporate PR didn't spin it. They simply moved on. But in private, the conversations were louder than ever. Who knew what? Who stayed silent? Who left too late? Jay-Z's testimony had not convicted Diddy. That task still belonged to the jury. But what it had done, undeniably, was put the cost of silence into a language the public could understand. That final week, Jay-Z returned to court once more. Not to testify, not to correct the record, but to sit quietly near the back of the room. No entourage, no spotlight, just presence. Cassie didn't look at him. Diddy did, briefly, and then looked away. And as the trial wound down, the culture responded in the only way it knows how, with posts, with threads, with fragments of clarity disguised as content. But in one quiet corner of the courtroom, a man who once walked into a room as a myth had walked out as something else, not fallen, not broken, reckoned. Because power, when left unspoken, isn't neutral, it becomes complicity. And Jay-Z chose the stand, not to save face, but to save what was left of his name, and maybe, just maybe, to warn those still watching from the velvet sidelines. Because in the end, the courtroom didn't just try Sean Combs, it tried the silence of an industry, and this time someone answered.